5 weapons that you are potentially sleeping on. So this is going to be a list of 5 weapons. They're not necessarily going to be the best weapons in the game. Well, one of them is actually shaping up to be absolutely murderous. However, these are just going to be weapons that I'm kind of just interested in building because they have a interesting, unique mechanic behind it. That's right, these are all going to be ultimates that are going to be very high power, very useful, or just have just like a unique build that you could potentially push around with. Now, annoyingly, I can't be showing all of these weapons with full builds just because I haven't quite got there yet. I'm working on them one at a time. So far, on my list of things that I have to do, I've done Thundercade, I've still got to do Python. Nezestra's Devotion's coming out, and that's actually one of the weapons on this list because I feel like people very, very unfairly shit on this weapon. But yeah, so these are all going to be weapons that I'm just going to be hopefully showing and maybe pique your interest in. Like I said though, these aren't necessarily going to be the best weapons in the game. Anyway, let's crack on with it. So up first we have Nezestra's Devotion, like I just said. Nezestra's Devotion is a hand cannon. It is very, very easy to actually get up to essentially maximum unique, and this weapon has caught a lot of shit because apparently it's nowhere near as good as Perforator, the weapon that does bonus damage against shielded enemies, of which shielded enemies are only one faction out of 3, discounting Colossi, and even at maximum unique buff, Perforator gets what, 5% chance to activate its ability against the Colossi, or hit a weak point with Devotion and reduce that enemy's defenses by 30%. Now, one thing I need to make clear is reducing enemies' defense by 30% doesn't mean 30% more damage. Against level 100 enemies, depending on faction, this is like 12 to 8%. Against most of the Colossi, it works out to about a 6% increase in total DPS, and once you start reaching things like Frostwalker as well as Molten Fortress, ends up being about 4 to 5%. This is still a marked increase across the team versus a 5% chance to perhaps maybe inflict more damage. Along with, and this is where I kind of get upset, and I have no idea where this came from, a lot of people seem to think Perforator does more DPS. Using just the standard burst DPS as well as sustained DPS calculations that basically everyone uses, that every game uses, Devotion in burst DPS does nearly 7% more. 6.94% more in burst DPS at level 1. In sustained DPS, which is what the game calculates, it's nearly 5% more, 4.84% more in sustained DPS. I then did it again at level 100. Again, it's just base calculations, so what the weapon comes with natively. Devotion wins again, 6.55% in burst and 4.62% in sustained. I have no idea where this information that Perforator does more DPS has actually come from, but it doesn't. And this is excluding Devotion essentially being able to reduce enemies' armor by 30%, depending on your accuracy, but you can have this up permanently. Devotion is probably the strongest hand cannon, bar none. Is it going to be the best weapon in the game? Probably not. It's a hand cannon. Is it the strongest hand cannon? Probably. Up next we have the last Dagger, and this is probably where I'm going to start to lose a lot of you, because it's a pistol, of course it's terrible, right? But the one thing that no one seems to have taken into account so far is how high those unique abilities stack. This is the 3rd upgrade on Last Dagger for the talent Ultimatum. Duration's 10 seconds, the recoil's now down to 5. I get 7% critical hit rate per stack. This is pretty impressive, and at maximum stack I get another 24 with 120% bonus damage. The bonus damage has been a 30% increase per edition. The critical hit rate per edition has been 4% at max stack, and then the stack increase on critical hit rate has been 1% each, and I'm also reducing the recoil by 5% each time. What this means is, at maximum buff, what this is going to look like is 8, 8, 28, and then 150. This is going to be one of the highest burst DPS weapons in the game, not for sustained DPS, which is what the game calculates, burst DPS. That initial, I want that add dead now damage. It's going to be very powerful. It is going to be. along with the fact that after you've got those stacks, you inflict stun. Now this could potentially have some worth in a Colossus fight. That's what probably most people are going to be aiming this video towards, or wanting this video to be aimed towards. I'm just talking in general here. For ad clear, this weapon is going to be very powerful. Very powerful. However, it is going to struggle in Colossus fights, and the idea of how you would work this in Colossus fights is basically build up Last Dagger to have 4 stacks, not 5, 4 stacks, and then not kill any more ads. So you'd kill 4 ads, and then just keep hitting the boss. That's kind of how it would work it. It's a little bit of micromanagement. Most people aren't going to go for that, but that's essentially how you would use this weapon in that area. Up next is the final masterpiece. Oh, and another pistol. I'm sure everyone's seething right now. The final masterpiece is probably one of the most balanced weapons in the game, which is why I'm going to be recommending it. And it also, from what I've checked so far, admittedly my unique ability is only at level 2 for this weapon, but from what I've checked so far, when it comes to burst DPS, this is the highest weapon in the game. It's actually kind of insane how strong this weapon potentially could be, depending on how high its stats go. And what I mean by this is, quite simply, this talent is kind of nutty. If you don't know how Final Masterpiece works, it's actually pretty simple. On reload, you gain a random buff. You'll either get weak point damage, critical hit rate, or fire rate. If you get the same buff twice in a row, it goes up a stage. If you get the same buff 3 times in a row, it goes to stage 3. Now, playing with this weapon a fair bit, getting stage 2 is pretty common. I've gotten stage 3 twice as of memory, but I'm not normally paying attention. I'm normally shooting things. So, stage 2 is pretty damn common. But what these buffs are, again, unique ability level 2, the duration is 7 seconds. This has definitely increased. I think it was about 5 when I first got it. Stage 1 for weak point damage is 9%, stage 2 is 16, and stage 3 is 29. The crit rate buff is 17 at stage 1, 31 at stage 2, and 56 at stage 3. And then the fire rate buff is 3% at stage 1, 5% at stage 2, and 10% at stage 3. When you have this unique ability maxed out, I would be interested to know, if someone has it maxed out, how high those numbers actually get. But building this for an all-round build with fire rate, crit chance, crit damage, weak point, etc., with this ability, depending on how long the buff actually lasts, as long as you get your firing time from start of magazine to end of magazine within that buff duration, this is going to be the highest burst DPS weapon in the game. Individually, just, I want that thing dead now. Done. Problem solved. I would also, weirdly, I know people are going to argue this, I would also recommend putting this weapon on something like a bunny. One, you actually run faster with pistols. Pistols and SMGs have the highest sprint speed, so your bunny will run faster. The second reason being, if your electric fuzziness doesn't kill them and just gets them low, this weapon will absolutely finish the job faster than you can friggin' blink. It will be absolutely crazy how well this weapon will work on something like a bunny. Next one's kind of a courtesy call, to be honest. Python. Now, the community seems split on this, and I find it absolutely bizarre. There are some people that recognize and understand how strong Python is, and there's some people in the community that just don't get it. What I have noticed is pretty much everyone that I've seen that doesn't get it isn't hitting weak points, and they're also not speccing into weak point as well as toxin, which is essentially what you want to do with this weapon. Hitting a weak point debuffs the enemy's toxic resistance as well as non-attribute resistance. What it means by non-attribute resistance is the level of damage they take from non-attribute skills, not normal defense. So there's a slight thing there. Enemies aren't particularly strong or weak to non-attribute characters or abilities. They're just kind of middle ground. They do have high resistances or lower resistances though when it comes to element, depending on what they are. That being said, the fact that this weapon by itself is able to not completely remove but negate some of that resistance as well as toxin resistance. Like, I use Python, which is a toxic built weapon, against things like Swamp Walker. It does better than Tamer. I've tested both. I've got a fully built Tamer. I've got a fully built Python. Python consistently does more. The only downside to Python, which I find a lot of people do struggle with, is consistently hitting weak points, which I 100% get, especially with some of the more obnoxious colossi, such as Gravewalker, Frostwalker, Swampwalker, etc., etc. They've got that very small weak point on front, and then their shoulders, or what you want to call them, have very weird, out-of-the-place weak points. But I promise you, at no point does anything realistically outperform Python when consistently hitting weak points. The problem is consistently hitting weak points, but I promise you 100% this thing is wrecking. With the build that I have and how I'm using it, if I'm consistently hitting weak points with all the debuff active, it's about 1.8 million sustained DPS, which is pretty damn nutty. At number 1 we have Enduring Legacy. Now Enduring Legacy works within a similar vein as Python, but rather than working with removing toxin resistance, it removes fire resistance, just fire resistance. It's also a crit weapon, which means we don't need to rely on hitting weak points. How this weapon specifically works is you need to be able to hit an enemy that is under the effect of a status, or the element proc. It doesn't actually matter what element proc it is. It can be chill, it can be toxin, it can be fire, it can be electrocution. It doesn't matter what one it is, but hitting them with essentially an element allows you to then remove the enemy's fire resistance, which means you actually kind of want to spec into fire. Along with the fact that it is an LMG, at which point a lot of people are going to go, oh, but Tamer. The moment you hit like even half stacks with Enduring Legacy, it outperforms Tamer. And you can basically have those stacks up, not permanently, but you're able to build them up very, very quickly. Along with the fact that this weapon has a higher critical hit rate. They're basically the same when it comes to weak point. The only difference would be is that Tamer has a higher fire rate and a higher base damage, which is near enough completely negated by the fact that Tamer is able to debuff the enemy's fire resistance. Even against Pyromaniac, Enduring Legacy does more. And this is just with a level 1 unique ability on Tamer. I'm yet to even get it to +1, which, if it works anything like Python, is just going to be more damage. Anyway, that is going to be it for now. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.